Hello, everyone. Hello, friends. My name is Andeea, and this is the first official episode of the Quantum Recovery Podcast. So, today I'm going to be sharing my story with you so you have an understanding of what led me into being a quantum health coach and getting certified in applied quantum biology. So, yeah, let's get started. So I just want to, before I actually get started, I want to make sure that you all know, you know, when we hear other people's stories, it there can be triggers, right? And I hear people's stories sometimes and I'm triggered. I go through life and I'm triggered, for gosh sakes. I still get triggered, even though I've done a lot of healing around my issues. So triggers are a sign that we have more healing to do. And it gives us an awareness. It highlights something for us. So if something I do say today triggers you, I want you to welcome that and invite it in and allow it to be an awareness of something that, you now have insight on that needs a little bit more love and attention. So with all that, I want to also say that I have not actually shared my story a lot. And the reason for that is in my story. I used to carry a lot of shame around the fact that my recovery story wasn't like everybody else's. So I was just comparing, and I actually have not heard too many people's stories, but I'll also get to that and why that, is that way and why I haven't heard many people's stories. Well, I have now since I've been a addiction counselor, but I mean, up until that point, I hadn't heard a lot of people's stories. So I grew up in a really small town in Minnesota, and I am the oldest of seven children, and I grew up in a very loving home. I remember my childhood. My childhood, we had all our needs met, and we had a lot of families at. I grew up Mormon, and we had a lot of families at our church that were also really close to us, and I remember really loving hanging out with my cousins, and I really loved the community. I loved being together with family. Family is something that I've always valued very, very much. So I used for 12 years of my life. So I'm going to be explaining to you today that 12 years of my life, and it was a very isolating time, but I was always like around a community of people, even if it wasn't an unhealthy, if it wasn't as a healthy of a community. Needless to say, I did always surround myself with community. And community is one of the biggest pieces of recovery, and what is one of our biggest tools that we have is community. So wanting to emphasize that, and for me there was a big lack because I didn't know about the recovery community until I was almost 8 years in recovery. So how did that happen? So let's see. Let's start in childhood. So in my childhood, there was sexual abuse, and I had an eating disorder at a young age. So around when I would think was maybe 12, my eating disorder developed. I had body dysmorphia. There was a lot of bullying. I attempted suicide in grade school and late grade school. In my little town I grew up in, when I say high school, just so you know, the town I grew up in was small. So my grade school was 1 through 6, and high school was 7 through 12. There was no like middle. You just jumped right into the high school. And then my this whole time had PD, and I so there were all these layers of things. I kept a secret, the sexual abuse, I kept it a secret for basically until I was 16, 17 years old. So I remember being I was really young, probably first or second grade. We were all sitting in this auditorium, and somebody came in to speak to us about good touch, bad touch. And had anyone ever, touched you in your private areas? And they asked people to like raise their hand, like anyone that had happened to would be raising their hand in front of all of their peers. Anyway, nobody raised their hand, but I didn't know that at the time. So I was just looking around, terrified. I was absolutely terrified because I was different. No one was raising their hand. It didn't happen to anybody else. Well, I ain't raising my hand. And I remember sitting there on this cold like floor, and my hands were just slipping and slipping, and I couldn't hold myself up because I was I was a nervous wreck. And my mom always had like this intuition of knowing that something, like, she obviously had an intuition because she every now and then she would ask us if, if anybody ever touched us. And I would always say no. And I was the one protecting my younger siblings also from being sexually abused. So I was holding on to the secret because I thought I would break the family. I would ruin the family if a secret like that ever came out. So that was always a secret all the way up until I was 16, 17 years old. And I'll get to that piece. But all this to say, I was getting signals from my environment that I was not good enough, and I was starting to form this identity, and I always felt I didn't have an identity. I was always trying on other people's identities, and I was getting all these mixed messages that for whatever reason I wasn't good enough, I wasn't worthy. Because people were bullying me, I was thinking that, nobody liked me, there was something wrong with me. No, I did have a group of friends that I'm some of them I'm still friends with to this day, but the the group it was a very small group, and I was always trying, to be liked by other people, but there was always something wrong with me. There was always something, I was just always fighting it, and I didn't know what it stemmed from. It was just always I've always had that imposter syndrome, just all into my adolescent years and into my young adult years. So my eating disorder kind of came about when I was in seventh or eighth grade. We were all sitting in English class, and we were waiting to go to gym. And in gym that day, we were going to be doing the polka. We were learning dance. And so we all knew we were going to need partners. So we were all kind of waiting for the bell to ring, picking a partner. And the person in front of me turned around and started chatting with me. And I said, "Hey, do you have a partner yet? Do you want to be my partner in gym class?" "No, you're too fat to be my gym partner." That was the answer I got. That was obviously devastating, and I'll never forget the moment that I was in that person said that to me. But from that moment on, there was a lot of yo-yo dieting, and I had, no major health issues, but lots of gut problems from that. I did try to starve myself. That didn't work out. Then I was like, I'm going to need to learn how to throw up. And I didn't know how to throw up, but I knew that that was my solution. That was what I thought was my solution. So I read a book about it and kind of taught myself how to have this eating disorder so I could be the size I was supposed to be liked by all the people. So I would stop, so people wouldn't bully me anymore. So all of this was going on. So for many years after that, I probably 4 more years that went on hiding, binge eating, and my body dysmorphia, all of that. It continued until I was about 16 years old, and my parents sent me to Mayo Clinic, and I was on the children's ward because I couldn't be on the adolescent ward. It was full. So I had to be with the small children. And there was this man who was kind of like a janitor. He did a lot of random like work around. He always made a point to talk to us. He drew your favorite Disney character and he would put it outside your door, and that's how he like kind of built rapport with all of the kids. And so one night I'm in bed sleeping, and I start to feel somebody trying to touch me on the top of my blanket. So I didn't panic, but I was terrified, and I just started to move underneath my blanket like I was going to wake up, and he left the room. Well, the next morning, of course, I told the doctors right away, And I was like, how could I trust you now? This happened last night, blah, blah, blah. And they pulled together what I now know is called a multidisciplinary team. So the doctor was there, the psychiatrist was there, the psychologist was there, everybody was there. And one of them asked me, has this ever happened to you before? And I started to hyperventilate and have a full-on panic attack. First panic attack I've ever had in my life at that point. And I then let the secret out because I had to. I had to. I couldn't hold the secret anymore. And my family did not blame me. I did not fall apart. All of the fear around me sharing what was happening didn't of course happen. Everybody was very loving. My family, I remember my family meeting together and discussing it, and you know, our family, we moved past it and we got through it. But I still held a lot of resentment for myself, and I held resentment of for the family member who was doing that, and I held a lot of resentment in, and I was very angry. I had a lot of anger issues when I was in my active use. And during my high school years, I tried a lot of different things. Of course, I was drinking, I was smoking, I was doing, smoking pot, and this is going to date me, but when when I tried crank, which was the name of the drug, I was in heaven. I was like, this is how I'm supposed to feel. And I believe I was 17 years old when I first tried that. And I was like, oh my gosh, where has this been? Because I knew alcohol was very caloric and I never liked drinking. I never liked anything that made me feel out of control. But I now knew that I really loved stimulants, and I was just going to stick with that. That was the only thing I wanted to do. It was the only thing I was interested in. And to kind of fit in with all the, crowds of people that I would end up being friends with throughout my using years, I would just kind of pretend like I was drinking. So I was always the sober driver. Well, if you can count being high on meth sober, I was always the non-drinker. So, but they didn't know that because I wanted to fit in with them, right? So I would actually fake like I was drinking. So I would fit in with the people that I was with because I didn't want them or any of that. Like had a fear of like being bullied or people not liking me. So I was always doing whatever I could to people please, to fit in with everybody. And that also led to a lot of perfectionistic tendencies as well. So lots of character defects I'm bringing up during this. So you just get a sense of the amount of all of the pieces of healing that have taken place throughout this. I was always with I wasn't always with a super abusive boyfriend, but I was always with people that weren't healthy for me to be with. And I was also have to admit, I wasn't a healthy friend to be with either. So I don't know where the people are at now, most of them. I don't know what happened to most of the people I used to be friends with. But at the time of my life, I was not a good friend to be around because I was in my active use and they were in their active use. But that is, I'm hoping that all those people are healthy and well now because, and I do think about it periodically, like, whatever happened to this person or that person, because I've just seen so much loss being a counselor, just so much death, because this is a life and death disease addiction, and it's very serious. And I'm very grateful that when I was using these drugs, you know, fentanyl was not an issue. That was not something that was around. I did end up trying opiates and I did not like them at all because they made me, that was a downer. So I didn't like anything that was a downer. So I find this diet pill, if you will, I was really liking the fact that it didn't make me feel like I wanted to eat. It was a great appetite suppressant. So I didn't actually have to have bulimia. So my coping skill for losing weight didn't have to be active if I was using, and then vice versa. So there was always, if one wasn't going on, the other was. So, clinically what we call a co-occurring disorder. So I always had that that co-occurring disorder. And then there were a lot of other, things happening under the surface from my past that were never addressed because I didn't get any type. I saw one therapist when I was younger, but it didn't last for very long. And then none of the other work that I did wasn't until I said I would stop using, which I'll get to. But anyway, so at this point, where are we at? So I didn't graduate. I started working at a casino and I befriended a group of friends, and I was very close friends with one woman and one girl in particular, and that I stayed friends with throughout. So as everybody kind of came and went in my life, she was kind of always a constant. She was always there. We always, there would be times where we didn't speak for periods of time and then we would get back together again. And she was one of the only friends that stuck around. All of my good friends from my younger years, they weren't using the types of drugs that I was. So I was not actively friends with them at that time in my life. But they would come back into my life later on. Now, after I started working at the casino, I worked there for like 6 years. And after that, I I was like, what am I going to be when I grow up? So I decided to be a makeup artist. I went to a trade school. I moved out to California. And for 6 months, I didn't use methamphetamines, but I still went out. I would go out drinking and things with the people I was trying to be friends with in the makeup school because I had no choice. I didn't have any connection to get the things that I wanted. So I always had a cross addiction to something else if I couldn't have the thing that I wanted. So that was always a running theme throughout my whole life. There was always something because I was not comfortable in my body. I was not comfortable in the identity, in my person, in my human. I was not comfortable. I didn't know who I was, and I was always seeking and trying to find out who I was because every everyone in my life was I was getting or I was perceiving the signals from all the other people in my life that there was something wrong with me. So now I am at a point where I moved back to Minnesota, I'm working retail, and I am in a couple of relationships. I get engaged a couple of times, and all of that fell through. And then I one day get a phone call that my friend it passed away. The girl I was close to, she passed away. So I go to my mom and my dad, and my mom was like, well, your brother's moving to New York. Why don't you move with him? So for whatever reason, treatment didn't get discussed. It was, you know, maybe this would be good for you to get out of here because my mom knew that, she knew my story. Like I was always in and out of the house every so often, basically stealing from them and, you know, asking for money and things like that. So they knew, my situation wasn't good there and that if I didn't leave there, it would probably just, end up happening again, or I would return to use again. So I was like, okay, let's do it. I'll move to New York. So I went and got a job at a salon, and I was a makeup artist there. And I worked there for like 3 years. And during that time, I moved out to New York. I wouldn't suggest a geographical change for anyone. I didn't know what was going on with me. I didn't know what post-acute withdrawal syndrome was. I didn't know some of the things that typically people get educated around when they do go to a treatment. I didn't know what was happening in my body, to my body. And I also stopped binging, or I still had binge eating disorder, but I was not throwing up. I was only I'd gorge myself with food, but I wasn't throwing up. So basically what I was doing is I told myself, I will be a vegan and that will allow me to eat just organic food and it'll be healthy. So I have no reason to throw it up because it's healthy, nutritious food. So that was kind of like what I did. And then I did start seeing a therapist when I was in New York and started working through some of the traumatic things that had happened in my life. So I am now done with I don't work at the salon anymore because I decided to go back to school. I was doing all my prerequisites for physical therapy, but my degree major was in psychology. So during my 4 years of undergrad, I was in a very, very abusive, toxic relationship. And that relationship I had to escape from. I escaped from that relationship 2 times. I went back to the person after the first time I escaped, and I was I was in school that whole entire time. So my what was I gonna say? My it was about 8 years. Okay, so I'm almost 8 years in recovery, and or I shouldn't say in recovery. 8 years of not using, not knowing what recovery is, and I'm in a behavioral pharmacology class. And in this class, the last chapter of the book is about addiction treatment. But the whole class was actually, up until that point, about what drugs do to the body. So I remember sitting there learning about, the types of things that these are all drugs that I used to use. And I remember being so amazed. I was like, oh my gosh, my body is so resilient because I don't have any of these problems that the book is saying that I should have, these health complications. For the most part, I'm pretty healthy. So what am I, a miracle? So I always thought I was just this terminally unique person. I'm the only one who almost died from addiction, blah, blah, blah. And to be honest, I never even identified with a person with addiction up until this point. I had no context. I just, I mean, I knew I had problems and I knew whatever, but I didn't have, like, these types of words didn't come out of my mouth at the time. So the professor of that class had her friend come in and share his story because he had been to addiction treatment. And he, of course, shared about the recovery programs the support groups that he had, like AA and NA. And I remember sitting there holding back my tears, realizing that this is the first time I'm hearing somebody's story. This is the first time I am hearing that, somebody could relate to me, right? I went to him after the class. I asked him to bring me to a couple of meetings. He was more than happy to. He brought me to an AA meeting and an NA meeting in the course of like a 2-week period. And then I get a phone call that my dad passes away. So at this point, my 4 of my brothers and sisters and we all lived in New York. So 4 out of the 7 of us, we all lived in New York. So we all went home for the funeral and we realized that somebody needed to move back home and be with my mom. So that person was me. I was ending schooling. I was trying to escape this toxic relationship. So I was the one that moved back home. So I move home and I now, at this point, I have all my schooling is for New York State physical therapy. So one of my professors actually had asked me after my dad had passed away, have you ever thought about being a counselor? And I was like, no, I have not thought about being a counselor. All my prerequisites are for physical therapy. I'm like in my 30s. I cannot change my major. So I it was kind of just a thought, whatever. And anyway, when I went back home, I realized I couldn't go to physical therapy school in Minnesota. So uh, my friend who had passed away, she had told me she had went to a treatment center at one point. So I was like, maybe I'll call this treatment center and I'll ask them where their counselors went to school, and then I'll figure out where I can go to school and maybe look into counseling. Well, I call the place and I have a wonderful conversation with them, and they say, well, actually, we do have a school. We are a graduate school. And so one thing led to another, and I find myself at an orientation starting my master's degree. like literally hearing the word and terms recovery for the first time. So at this point, I'm like very excited to learn about addiction. I'm addicted learning to learn about addiction. And I was just so excited, but I had this like imposter syndrome because I was like, well, I just started to go to meetings, and I even though I had all of this time of not using under my belt, I felt like I was just learning. So as I'm learning about, clinical things, I'm also doing my own recovery programming on the side and learning more about that. I end up getting a sponsor and doing the work there. Shortly after that, I meet a wonderful coach who shares with me about toxins and how to be toxin free. So of course, a person who puts a lot of substances in their body my whole entire life, like, I would have pretty much tried anything that you gave me. And definitely if it was a stimulant, it didn't matter if it was covered in whatever, blood, I would have taken it. And now I'm like, I don't want any medicine. I don't want anything toxic, blah, blah, blah. So I start learning about environmental toxins and whatnot. Well, this led me to different ways of eating. Now, mind you, this whole time in my story, I've pretty much been yo-yo dieting. I have major gut issues and some, other like smaller things, but I don't have like an autoimmune. I don't have, I've never had cancer. I don't have some of the bigger issues that a lot of people, have healed with quantum health principles. But what I did have was I had a lot of joint pain. I had this inability to lose weight. I was always kind of this 20 to 30 pounds that I could not lose. And I had chronic fatigue, insomnia. I had you know, the stress and all of the mental health stuff that was unaddressed, and I was constantly going and finding different therapists to work on that stuff. And I had the inability to have children. I'd often lose my hair. I had a lot of hair loss issues. And so that's just some of like the underlying health things. And I'm listing those out right now because those aren't issues for me anymore. And it's because my journey in it pretty much started when I really truly was in recovery. I really started my healing process. I started to learn little aspects of quantum health, but I didn't know that I was learning quantum health until about a year and a half ago. I started really diving deep, and then I got certified in applied quantum biology. But the practices and the principles, I only wish I had them when I was first entering, my true recovery, when I didn't know, like, this is why I'm so passionate about sharing with for people who are in, whether you're in early recovery, whether you're in long-term recovery, maybe your story is similar to me and you didn't get treatment, and you have kind of the same path. Either which way, I love educating people on this information because because what we don't know, we don't know, right? We want to, know about all these things so we have an awareness so we can actually start the healing process. But the quantum principles have helped me so much in my healing journey that I want to share them with everyone. I want to make sure that people have access to the things that are going to help them. And most of these things are free. We all have access to them. And these are the things that I'm going to be sharing in this podcast. So that pretty much wraps up my story, and the reason why I am sharing what I'm sharing, the reason why I'm doing what I'm doing today, which is sharing the quantum principles and practices with people who have addiction or are in recovery from really anything. Doesn't have to be a substance use addiction. It can be a behavioral addiction, and it doesn't even have to be addiction. It can be from other, chronic illnesses. These practices and principles truly, truly do help and heal people. And I've seen it with my own eyes clinically, and I've also helped hundreds of people with addiction. And this is something that can really be a game changer for people in recovery, especially when it comes to early recovery and post-acute withdrawal syndrome. So knowing about the toxins, not only in our environment that bioaccumulate, but also blue light toxicity, and non-native EMFs. So we're going to be diving into those topics. If you don't know what these things are, it's okay. You're going to learn it here if you stick around. And I'm so excited to share all this stuff with you. So that's all I'm going to share for today. I hope you got a good idea of where I'm coming from and my story. And I'm just so honored you're here. I'm honored to be of service to you as well. And yeah, I hope to see you soon. Drink water, call your peers. Have a good day.